I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to say a few words at the Albany United National Anti-War Conference, and I'm sorry that circumstances make it impossible for me to be there with you in person. There's no need to elaborate on the significance of the task that you're undertaking or the scale of the challenge. We all know that very well. To repeat some things well known to all of us, the United States spends about as much on war and preparation for war as the rest of the world combined. It's technologically far more advanced. There are plans on the books for future wars that range from tiny drones that can murder people in their living rooms to space platforms for near instantaneous and massive destruction anywhere in the world. The United States is responsible for about 70% of arms sales, and the United States is alone in barring a global treaty in regulating the global arms trade. Actually, for accuracy, the United States is not quite alone. It was joined by Zimbabwe in the latest vote at the United Nations, a fact which is apparently too embarrassing to merit reporting. The United States is, of course, now fighting 2 wars of aggression in Asia, and it's planning a third. Military spending is escalating to unprecedented heights under Obama. Much concern is being whipped up about the deficit. Let's put aside the fact that we should be running a deficit to grow out of the economic catastrophe that was caused by the financial institutions that are now put in charge of putting Band-Aids on the cancer for which they're primarily responsible, along with their representatives in Washington. But taking the deficit seriously, about half of it is due to military spending, and the rest is mostly due to the hopelessly inefficient and costly healthcare system imposed by the same hands. But the obvious ways to deal with the deficit are off the agenda. Rather, attention is focused on depriving poor people of their meager benefits. Well, considerations such as these are serious enough for those who care about this country, but they're of course marginal as compared with the costs to the victims of our dedication to criminal violence. I'll omit the horrifying details which are familiar to all of us. Well, I happen to be speaking a month before your meeting in Albany, and the current pace of events is so fast that what I say is sure to be outdated by the time you meet, at least in part. I'm speaking shortly after the McChrystal fiasco, and in fact on the day of the confirmation of his superior, General Petraeus, as his replacement. It's generally assumed, and quite plausibly, that among the consequences of this change will be relaxation of the rules of engagement so that it becomes easier for U.S. forces to kill civilians, and also extension of the war well into the future, as Petraeus uses his considerable clout in Congress to achieve this result. The same may well be true of the war in Iraq. I won't run through the ugly history of that, but we'll only mention one crucial feature of that war. The U.S. invaders were compelled to retreat step by step from their initial war aims. That's a major triumph of mass nonviolent resistance in Iraq. The invaders were quite competent at killing insurgents, but they could not deal with hundreds of thousands of demonstrators calling for elections that the occupying authorities sought desperately first to avoid, then when they couldn't prevent them, to subvert. These facts are, of course, denied by apologists, but they're understood by the most serious analysts. One good example is the fine British correspondent and Middle East specialist Jonathan Steele, His important book on the war is called Defeat, quite accurately. As the U.S. was forced to back down, war aims came to be stated with greater clarity. The usual boilerplate about democracy did not suffice, as Washington sought to hang on in the face of Iraqi resistance and domestic opposition to the war that it was unable to quell. In November 2000, the Bush administration issued a declaration of principles for the United States and the Iraqi government. The declaration states that the U.S. forces are to remain indefinitely in Iraq, and it commits Iraq to facilitate and encourage the flow of foreign investments to Iraq, especially American investments. I'm quoting. This brazen expression of imperial will was underscored a few months later when Bush issued another one of his signing statements. In this, he declared, and I'll quote here, that he'll reject crucial provisions of congressional legislation that he had just signed, including the provision that forbids spending taxpayer money to establish any military installation or base for the purpose of providing for the permanent stationing of United States armed forces in Iraq, or to exercise U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. In short, nothing of that kind will be tolerated, even if it's passed by Congress and signed by the President. Well, that was January 2008. That was a last gasp. Shortly after that, the Bush administration was compelled to sign a status of forces agreement with Iraq that eliminated all of these demands. At least formally, and I stress formally, the United States is committed to withdraw its forces in 2011, and in fact, oil firms, have not done well at all in the competition for Iraqi resources. But again, I stress formally. There's very little reporting from Iraq, and information is quite sparse. It does appear, however, that construction of the huge military bases, U.S. military bases, is continuing, and it's explicit that Obama has budgeted a substantial increase for the huge U.S. embassy in Baghdad, not like any embassy anywhere in the world. It's in fact a city within a city. And Obama has also budgeted similar proposals for Islamabad and Kabul. All of this indicates plainly enough that the Obama administration is preparing for a long stay with a heavy footprint. Well, as if 2 wars in the region are not enough, Obama is now building up for a 3rd war against Iran. It's widely claimed that Iran poses the most severe crisis facing the United States. Congress has just strengthened the sanctions against Iran. Obama has been rapidly expanding its offensive capacity in the African island of Diego Garcia, which is claimed by Britain. Britain had expelled the population so that the United States could build the massive military base that it uses for attacking the Middle East and Central Asia. The Navy is expanding facilities there for nuclear-powered guided missile submarines with Tomahawk missiles, which can carry nuclear warheads. Each submarine is reported to have the striking power of a typical naval carrier battle group. The Obama buildup also includes hundreds of so-called bunker buster bombs, the most powerful in the arsenal short of nuclear weapons. These are intended for blasting hardened underground structures, aimed for Iran, of course. The planning for these bombs began under Bush, but languished. Obama accelerated the program sharply as soon as he took office, and they're now to be deployed years ahead of schedule, of course, aimed at Iran. A very respected British strategic analyst, Dan Plesh, he points out, I'm quoting him, they're gearing up totally for the destruction of Iran. U.S. bombers and long-range missiles are ready today to destroy 10,000 targets in Iran in a few hours. The firepower of U.S. forces has quadrupled since 2003, accelerating rapidly under Obama. A U.S. fleet, along with an Israeli naval vessel, is reported to have passed through the Suez Canal on the way to the Persian Gulf, where its task, according to Arab press reports, I'm quoting, is to implement the sanctions against Iran and supervise the ships going to and from Iran. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, visited Afghanistan a couple of days ago, a couple of days before I'm speaking. On his return, he went to Israel to meet senior military officers and planners. The major Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, reports, I'm quoting, that the meeting focused on the preparation by both Israel and the United States for the possibility of a nuclear-capable Iran. Almost none of this has been reported here, although, or maybe a cynic might say, because it's plainly of extreme significance and urgency. These increasing threats of military action against Iran are, of course, in violation of the United Nations Charter, and they're also in specific violation of Security Council Resolution 1887 of September 2009, which reaffirmed the call to all states to resolve disputes related to nuclear issues specifically, peacefully, in accordance with the Charter, which they're speaking specifically of the Middle East region. The Charter, of course, bans the use or the threat of force. Well, what exactly is the Iranian threat? There are many apocalyptic pronouncements, but they don't descend to the level of evidence or argument. There's also an authoritative answer. It was provided by several government reports to Congress on the military threat of Iran last April. The brutal clerical regime in Iran is doubtless a threat to its own people, but it does not rank particularly high in that respect in comparison to U.S. allies in the region, particularly Egypt, which Obama went out of its way to praise. And of course, it's not the threat to the population of Iran that concerns the report. Rather, it's concerned with the threat that Iran poses to the region and to the world. Well, the report makes it clear that the Iranian threat is not military. Quote the report, Iran's military spending is relatively low compared to the rest of the region, and of course minuscule as compared to that of the U.S. They say that Iranian military doctrine, I'm quoting again, is strictly defensive, designed to slow an invasion and force a diplomatic solution to hostilities. Iran, they say, has only a limited capability to project force beyond its borders. What about the nuclear option? Well, the report says that Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy, not offensive. Though the Iranian threat is not military, that does not mean that it might be tolerable to Washington. Iranian deterrent capacity is an illegitimate exercise of sovereignty that interferes with U.S. global designs. Specifically, it threatens U.S. control of Middle East energy resources. That's been a very high priority of planners since World War II. They recognize that control of Middle East energy resources provides substantial control of the world, quoting one influential liberal Democrat 60 years ago expressing a common understanding. That's A.A. Burley. Iran's threat goes beyond deterrence. It's also seeking to expand its influence. That's called destabilizing the region. U.S. invasion and military occupation of Iran's neighbors, that's called stabilization. Iran's effort to extend its influence in neighboring countries is destabilization, hence plainly illegitimate, which is incidentally normal usage. Beyond the crimes of deterrence and trying to establish friendly relations with neighbors, Iran is also supporting terrorism. The government reports continue by backing Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah and Hamas happen to be the major political forces in Lebanon and in Palestine. That is, if elections matter. In this case, the only relatively free elections in the Arab world. Well, it's normal and understandable for elite opinion to fear the threat of democracy and to act to deter it, but this is a rather striking case, particularly alongside of strong U.S. support for the brutal regional dictatorships. Well, there's a lot to say about the terrorist acts attributed to Hamas and Hezbollah, which pale in comparison to U.S.-Israeli terrorism in the same region, and in large measure are resistance to U.S.-Israeli aggression and violence. And they could also easily be terminated if the United States and Israel wanted to do so. In the case of Hamas, that means accepting ceasefires and, in general, accepting political settlement instead of preferring violence, brutal repression, and expansion, as they're doing, recognizing that they're in violation of international law and even specific Security Council resolutions. Well, that's a long topic. I've talked and written about it elsewhere as of others, and I won't go into it here. There is a model for democracy in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, despite serious flaws, namely Turkey, which has relatively free elections and has also been subject to harsh criticism in the U.S., particularly by the Obama administration, which was particularly incensed just a few weeks ago when Turkey joined with Brazil in arranging a deal with Iran to restrict Iran's enrichment of uranium. The deal was pretty much along the lines that the U.S. had in fact demanded. Obama had praised this initiative in a letter to Brazil's president, Lula da Silva. Apparently he did that on the assumption that the initiative would fail and would provide a propaganda weapon against Iran. Well, the initiative succeeded. The U.S. was furious and quickly undermined it by ramming through a Security Council resolution that was so meaningless that China cheerfully joined at once, recognizing that at most the limited sanctions would impede Western interests in competing with China for Iran's resources. Once again, Washington acted forthrightly to ensure that others would not interfere with U.S. control of the region, whatever the effect on proliferation. The political class understands very well the threat of independent forces in the region. So Stephen Cook, who's a scholar with the Council on Foreign Relations, he pointed out that the critical question now is, in his words, how do we keep the Turks in their lane, following orders like good Democrats? A New York Times headline captured the general mood. It reads, "Iran deal seen as spot on Brazilian leader's legacy." In brief, do what we say or else you'll suffer the consequences. If that's unclear, any mafia don can explain. There's no indication that other countries in the region favor U.S. sanctions any more than Turkey does. On Iran's opposite border, Pakistan and Iran have just signed an agreement for a new pipeline, signed it in Turkey, in fact. Even more worrisome for the United States is that the pipeline might extend to India. The U.S. has been trying hard to stop that. In 2008, the United States reached a treaty with India supporting India's nuclear programs, which indirectly supports its nuclear weapons programs, and that was pretty clearly intended to stop India from joining the pipeline. India and Pakistan, incidentally, are two of the three nuclear powers that have refused to sign the nonproliferation treaty. The third one is Israel. All have developed nuclear weapons with U.S. support and still do under Obama. Well, no sane person wants Iran to develop nuclear weapons, or for that matter, anyone. One obvious way to mitigate or maybe eliminate this threat is to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, that issue arose once again at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference at the UN headquarters in early May of this year. Egypt is the chair of the 118 nations of the non-aligned movement, and as chair, it proposed that the conference back a plan calling for the start of negotiations on a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, as in fact had been agreed by the West, including the United States, at the 1995 review conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, Washington was kind of backed into a corner, and it formally agreed, but it insisted that Israel be exempted. And of course, it has given no hint of allowing such provisions to apply to itself. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton stated, yeah, wonderful idea, but she said the time is not ripe. Washington also insisted that no proposal can be accepted that calls for Israel's nuclear program to be placed under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency, as in fact the Energy Agency is now advocating, though without report here. And U.S. again insisted that no proposal can be accepted that calls on signers of the treaty, including Washington, to release information about Israeli nuclear facilities and activities, including information pertaining to previous nuclear transfers to Israel. I'm quoting Washington's position. All of that is blocked. Obama's technique of evasion is to adopt Israel's position that any such proposal for a nuclear weapons-free zone must be conditional on a comprehensive peace settlement, which the United States can delay indefinitely, as it's been doing for 35 years, with rare and temporary exceptions. Well, Obama, of course, has made a rhetorical commitment to nonproliferation. That's received much praise, even a Nobel Peace Prize. One practical step in this direction is establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones. Another is withdrawing support for the nuclear weapons programs of the three non-signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, as often is the case, rhetoric and actions are hardly aligned. In fact, they're in direct contradiction in this case, facts that pass with essentially no comment or attention. Well, instead of taking practical steps towards reducing the dire threat of nuclear weapons proliferation, the United States is proceeding to take major steps towards reinforcing U.S. control of the vital Middle East oil-producing regions by violence, if other means do not succeed, with very ugly prospects. Well, let me turn finally, briefly, to Obama's major current war, Afghanistan. The official goal is to protect ourselves from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is what's called a virtual organization with no specific base. The professional literature describes it as a network of networks, an example of what's called leaderless resistance. That's even more so now than before. Whatever Al-Qaeda is, it has relatively independent factions loosely associated throughout the world. As for Afghanistan, the latest CIA estimate is that there may be 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda activists in Afghanistan. And there isn't the slightest indication that the Taliban want to repeat the mistake of offering sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, which raises questions about what we're doing in Afghanistan. Well, there is a new strategy, as you know, and the first exercise of Obama's new strategy was when U.S. Marines recently conquered Marja, a small town in Helmand province, which is the main center of the insurgency. Here's the report about that from the New York Times. Quote, "The Marines have collided with a Taliban identity in Marja so dominant that the movement appears more akin to the only political organization in a one-party town with influence that touches everyone. We've got to reevaluate our definition of the word enemy," said Brigadier General Larry Nicholson, commander of the Marine Expeditionary Force in Helmand Province. Continuing with Nicholson, "Most people here identify themselves as Taliban. We have to readjust our thinking. So we're not trying to chase the Taliban out of Marja, we're trying to chase the enemy out, namely the Taliban." Well, you can parse that if you like. But the Marines are actually facing a problem that has always bedeviled conquerors and that is very familiar to the United States from Vietnam. Back in the early 60s, the leading U.S. government scholar lamented that the enemy was, as he put it, the only truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam, and any effort to compete with it politically would be like a conflict between a minnow and a whale. Our minnow, their whale. Therefore, the only strategy the U.S. could undertake is to overcome the enemy's political force by using Washington's comparative advantage in violence, with horrifying results that I don't have to review. Others have faced similar problems. For example, the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where they won every battle but lost the war. Although it's interesting to learn from the top U.S. experts there who were fighting with the Mujahideen in the 80s and who now say that the Russians were indeed beginning to make progress by the mid-80s when they adopted the now fashionable Petraeus coin strategy. And the same experts agree that they might have won had it not been for the massive support for the Mujahideen by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, which included high-tech weapons that neutralized Russian helicopter forces. Also well to remember that the goal, according to the CIA officially, was not to liberate Afghanistan, but to kill Russians. The U.S. faces no such opposition in Afghanistan. Well, after the Marja triumph, the U.S.-led forces were poised to assault the major city of Kandahar. The U.S. Army took polls there, which it released, and discovered and reported that the military operation is opposed by 95% of the population, and that 5 out of 6 people there regard the Taliban as, in their words, our Afghan brothers. Well, that's again echoes of earlier conquests. For these reasons, the plans were delayed. That's part of the background for the McChrystal fiasco. Well, under these circumstances, it's not in the least surprising that the authorities are concerned that domestic public support, now low, may erode even farther. There was a recently leaked CIA memorandum which observes that the Afghanistan mission's low public salience has allowed French and German leaders to disregard popular opposition and to steadily increase their troop contributions to the U.S. war, despite the opposition of 80% of the German and French publics. It's therefore necessary, they say, to tailor messaging to forestall or at least contain backlash. And several proposals follow for how to delude the public. In the United States, the media can be counted on to fulfill the needed role voluntarily. Well, this CIA memorandum should remind us that states have an internal enemy, their own population, which has to be controlled when state policy is opposed by the public, as is often the case. The battle to control the internal enemy is highly pertinent today, and it should be a prime concern for those who hope to confront today's severe challenges, as you're now doing, and your task could hardly be more important. Thanks.